Werewolf in the Haunted House. Dear Scary Stories NYC. I worked in a Halloween haunted house attraction way back in the early 80s, but things were a lot more primitive than they are now. The reason I'm writing to you about it is that we once had a really bad situation when somehow a real werewolf or dogman or something of that nature got into the attraction and caused a stampede for the exits. I actually smelled the breath of the creature as I had foolishly walked right up to the beast to try to figure out whose eyes were behind that mask. But it was no mask, and those were the real, actual eyes of some kind of upright canine predator. I don't want to say exactly where this haunted house was, because I don't want this story traced back to me. But it was in the country by the woods. My father used to say it was in the suburbs, when I would call it the country, and I guess it was sort of both. But the backyard of that old house was right on the edge of a woodland that extended up and past a small mountain range that I could see from there on clear enough days. I guess that gives you a little clue as to our location. I come from a long line of people who live up in the hills, even though that wasn't part of my personal upbringing, which was fairly urban. I always found the woods behind the haunted house attraction to be intimidating. They even looked dark on sunny days, and most of them never seemed to lose their leaves, which kept the place looking impenetrable long after we were packing up and leaving in November. I felt a weird sense of bitterness from that darkness, or maybe resentment would be a better word. It didn't seem to like me, and I felt like it didn't like any of the others any better. It didn't want us there. I felt unwelcome. Working inside the house was actually a lot of fun. When we started, the idea was just to do a tour where people would walk through, and they would pass life-size dummies we made up of monsters and zombies and werewolves. But then one of us got the bright idea that we should stick occasional real people wearing costumes in among the life-size dummies, and have them hold perfectly still. Then, at a crucial moment, they could go rawr and jump out at someone. It added a lot to the scare quotient, as we used to jokingly refer to it. Once we had done one successful jump scare, we decided to add a second, and a third. We still kept some rooms just only filled with dummies of monsters and dead people, so that the customers might sometimes let their guard down. Our theory was that horror was the opposite of music. Or no, wait, we were saying that it was like music that suddenly goes wrong. It's danger arising out of what seems to be harmony at first. What do you want? We all viewed ourselves as young artists and intellectuals, so we were into defining and redefining everything around us. Now, there were a lot of werewolves in our house. I think there must have been a sale on werewolf masks somewhere, because we had even more werewolves than zombies. And we raided Goodwill to find clothing to cover them up with. We also looked around for cheap bits of fake fur we could use for some of them, but for the most part we could only afford to cover the werewolves up with old clothing and put a werewolf mask on it. Still, you got accustomed quickly to seeing upright canines when you worked there, or even if you were a paying customer. And you got accustomed to seeing some of them move around, too. Another thing that has to be included when talking about what happened that year is that a number of the people working on that haunted house were complete practical jokers. Like, for instance, we had dug fresh graves in the basement and had a gag about a body lying in one of the graves coming to life. Then we had another gag about one of our actors threatening to throw one of the customers into the other grave. But it wasn't really a customer. We had an actor walk in with the customers and act like they had paid to get in. That's not the practical joke part. But one of the guys working there got some of the others to agree to throw the newest cast member into one of the graves, then lock her in for the night. Everyone agreed to participate, but they actually warned the new girl about what was about to happen. And they turned it back on the guy whose idea it was. Instead of the girl being locked in the basement all night, it was the practical joker who suffered the fate he had planned for the newbie. That was the way those guys were. They liked to scare, and they liked to laugh. And if you were too thin-skinned to take it, then you better clear on out of there. That job was not for the faint of heart. And we didn't go easy on the customers either. We weren't full contact, and we didn't make you sign a contract agreeing to let us touch you. This was way before all that got started. But we would get in people's faces. We would tickle them sometimes, we would grab them by the shoulder and redirect them other times. I don't know what the legality of that sort of stuff was back then, but this was back when human beings were still human, and no human was going to sue over getting touched by someone redirecting them at an amusement park or a haunted house attraction. Not in those days. So I wonder how long this werewolf was active inside the house before anyone noticed that he wasn't part of the show. Maybe he got noticed right away, or maybe he had been there for a while. I didn't see him until after a few people had already started talking about him. I was working as a corpse that came back to life in our morgue set, which was at the end of the walkthrough. Now, although there was only one way for the paying audience to walk, we had other rooms closed off, and this old house had a secret passageway leading from the main bedroom to what used to be the servants' quarters, and a secret hallway inside the fireplace that led to an underground tunnel area that we were using for storage and repair. This was separate from the main basement, so I wonder what the original owner of this house was up to back in those old days. Anyway, we used the secret areas to bring people out of the house if they got sick or if they got too scared. Fortunately for us, we never had any serious injuries, but that's the same way we plan to bring out injured customers if that should happen. And when that werewolf or dogman showed up that night, those little narrow secret tunnels and rooms all got filled past capacity with panicked and terrified people trying to get out. You know, we did have warning signs that something strange was going on, but we chose to ignore them at first. Like 3 or 4 different people went up to the greeter at the front door to complain about the white werewolf actor inside, saying that he was rude and gruff and overly aggressive. The word got back to all of us inside, but I didn't personally know what a white wolf man was, at least not in the context of that haunted house attraction. The werewolves were all mannequins and dummies as far as I could remember, so I wasn't sure how to interpret that word from the front door as it filtered back to us. The way we ran the show back then, we were sort of all designers, all performers, and all security as well. So I did have conversations with other co-workers inside the house, asking if they knew about the white werewolf and what the problem was with him. He had not come to our area inside the building yet, I suppose. Either that or I had been too busy to notice him when he did. At some point later in the evening, I heard a customer come into my area complaining about that white wolf man, and I broke character to ask her what she was talking about. She told me that the white werewolf was too realistic, and it almost gave her a heart attack. Her boyfriend or husband seemed more frightened than she was, but he was trying to act tough, like he was defending his woman. Still, he demanded I do something about this white wolf man, so I felt I had to. I got the rough directions from the irate couple, and I set off in that direction hoping to find out if this was one of our people or some troublemaker who snuck a wolfman mask into the attraction. We had a rule that customers were not allowed to wear masks, and we didn't allow masks inside. But once in a while, some kid snuck a Frankenstein mask inside his pants or whatever, and we dealt with it when we had to. I thought this might end up being one of those kind of situations. I walked from room to room slowly in the dark, eyeballing each werewolf mannequin I passed, and it seemed like there was 1 or 2 in every room that year. I didn't want to miss this creature, so I even went up close to the darker furred werewolves and tapped them to make sure they weren't someone in a costume. I didn't have to be so careful. When I finally came upon the white werewolf, there could be no question about who this was. He was bigger than anyone I had ever seen, and he was hunched over almost like a gorilla, to be honest. Why I didn't turn and run away, I am uncertain. I mean, it was the Halloween season, and we were in a Halloween haunted house. If ever someone would figure out how to make a big white werewolf costume, it was going to be right then and right there. So in spite of the fact that there were several visual clues for me, which indicated that this was too large to be a man in a costume, I walked forward toward the Beastman, still operating under that clearly false conclusion. I was to blame for the panic as much as the werewolf was, to be honest. If I had remained calm after I saw what I saw, things might have gone differently. I even mentally prepared myself about how I was going to react if I saw that the person playing the white werewolf was not one of our personnel. I was going to remain professional. I was rehearsing my every action in my head. But when I leaned close to look into the eyes behind the mask, and I saw that this was a real dog face, and I had spooked those inhuman monster eyes by coming so close, uninvited. The creature's eyes reacted in this way that human eyes don't react, and it bared its teeth at me, something that no rubber mask in the early 80s was yet able to do, as far as I knew. It growled and it got unhappy, and I screamed like a woman. I'm not, by the way. A woman, I mean. But you would never have known it from the way I was screeching. Then I made things even worse by running while I was screaming, telling everyone, "This isn't part of the show! This isn't part of the show!" The rest of the crew had no idea what I was talking about, but they professionally shepherded people through our system of secret rooms and passageways to get most of them to safety before even my co-workers knew what was going on. We didn't even have a central video security setup, so everything ran by word of mouth. It's a miracle we didn't encounter a lot more disasters than just this one. Let me do for you what I neglected to do for my co-workers and customers at the time, which is give you a full description of what caused my state of panic. This was a big wolfman or dogman figure. He was taller than anyone I'd ever seen, but he never stood all the way up. In fact, most of the time he had one long front arm on the ground, which allowed him to use the other like a hand. He could walk on his hind legs and use both hands, but it looked to me as though he would have been more comfortable down on all fours. Although I never got to see the Beastman run, I bet he ran more like a dog, or at least like one of the great apes. I doubt he ran bipedally, although I expect he could easily walk that way. I think he was up on his hind legs inside the haunted house show, because of the cramped quarters and because of all the upright bipedal mannequins and humans. That's just my gut feeling. Like if he were walking through the woods, I bet he'd do it down on all fours. At least when he didn't need to use his hands or arms to hold something, or to grab something. This creature had fangs all the way around, as though the only kind of food he was designed to consume was flesh that needed to be torn away from the bone. This was a carnivore. This was not a vegan. I didn't know if it ate humans, but it certainly gave me the impression that he'd be willing to give me a taste test. So the creature I was running from started freaking out, mainly because of me. It threw the mannequins around and made a mess of things. We later determined which back door it had left through by following the trail of half-destroyed spooky exhibits, but we never did figure out how it had gotten in. We had a couple of main theories, which I guess I should get to now. Some of us at the time felt that the incident was kicked off by a man who turned into a werewolf in the dark when he got too scared. I suppose that theory makes sense in some ways, but the beast I saw wore no clothing. And we never found a discarded set of men's clothes left around anywhere inside as far as I know. The others told me I was making no sense, but I blame the forest for what happened. I blame those hills. I think that our fun and merriment, the screams that we got out of people with our jump scares, I think that kept the hills awake. And I think that creature who caused all the havoc was sent down to us by the hills and the woods to shut us up and close us down. It worked, too. At first we closed temporarily to regroup, but not enough of us were willing to go back to work there after what happened. And we ended up doing a shortened version of it in an old barn donated by a church for a few days leading up to Halloween. Even getting people to go into the old house during the day to fetch the props and move them to the barn was difficult, as people had become convinced that monsters either lived inside there or were able to enter through the underground subterranean passageways. There were just too many hiding places inside that house for most of us to feel that we could keep it operating safely for the public or for ourselves. One of my friends and collaborators back then called the monster the Polar Bear Wolfman, which is a name I kinda liked. None of us called it a Dogman, because I don't know if that name was even around yet. Maybe among loggers and lumberjacks, but I don't know if Dogman had gotten mainstream yet in the early 80s. At least none of us used that term, and I hadn't heard it yet. There was a general disagreement among the others about my idea that this was a wild animal that slipped into the building, since the old place was so incredibly difficult to seal up. It had too many ways in and out, and that was in my mind the most logical solution. But the rest of them had this idea in their head from the movies, that if a wolf walks upright like a man, then it has to be a werewolf. It must be a wolfman. Can you imagine if a werewolf did get into our haunted house, and then transformed in front of everybody? I wonder how many people would have run away in fright, and how many would have thought that it was just part of the show. I ended up working in haunted houses seasonally for another 9 years, or maybe it was 10 after that. I always took charge of security after that year, and I always worked with a security camera setup after that. I missed performing as a monster or a madman, but I was happier sitting in the control booth behind the monitors. This way, if I ever saw a werewolf or dogman inside the attraction ever again, I could sound the alarm from a safe distance. Because I'll tell you something, if I ever suspect a creature is a dogman or werewolf in the future, I am not going to get up in his face and look in his eyes. I'm just going to give him the benefit of the doubt, and I am going to hit the ground running. And I'd advise you to do the same thing. Happy Halloween. Speaking of Halloween, check out Dogman here wearing our new Scary Stories merch, which is linked to in the description. There's some cool looking stuff. Be sure to check it out. And now let's journey to Bigfoot's secret abode, where he awaits us with some of his famous rhyming. Biggie? REP, today is not one but two souls, because of Valerie Gomez and Nicole. Please join me in welcoming Valerie Gomez and Nicole back to our channel memberships. They get to see our weekly secret uncensored stories, of which I think we actually had 3 this week. Here to tell you more about how you can help us stay alive, and what you get in return, is our international TV spokesmongrel, Henry Lee Dogman. Hank? Thanks, Biggie, and thanks to all of you for watching this far. If you liked it, please click like. If you'd like to see more of our work, please subscribe. And also click that bell icon if you'd like to be notified when we put out a new episode. To become an executive producer, you can donate to us through the thanks button under each of our videos, or through our paypal.me/PeterBernard209 page. To receive cool perks like secret uncensored Dogman episodes far too wild to ever run on this channel, you can become a YouTube channel member by clicking the join button, or join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. Joining either at the $3 a month level or above gets you access to our over 25 hours of secret uncensored Dogman stories available nowhere else. Do you have a scary story about Dogman or some other kind of high strangeness that happened to you? Let us know by emailing us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or by leaving us a voicemail message at 804-LA-SCARY. You may need to call back on that when it cuts off after I think 3 minutes. And if you don't want to do any of that stuff, thank you for simply watching to the end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.